Welcome to the If Not Now, When podcast series. And my guest today is Mr. Kola Aina, who is the managing partner of Ventures Platform Fund. And he has raised several funds and has been investing in Nigeria's tech ecosystem for years.
Yep.
And he's, one of the, I would say, key players and leaders in the industry. And I wanted to talk to you today about Nigeria's tech ecosystem, how we got here, what we should expect in the future, what are some obstacles and growths. But first, thank you for being here.
No, thanks for having me. Delighted to finally have this conversation with you, Amaka, and hopefully we can have a good time at it. Thanks.
Yeah, I know we've been trying to schedule this for a while.
We have.
You're a very busy man.
It's great. You're busy too, so it's great that we finally get to
the time.
Yeah.
So let's start with, I guess, a fairly broad question.
Sure.
In 2000, so I would say over the past 20 years or so, the ICT sector has been, which obviously includes telecoms, but a lot of the tech sector is also driven by the I would say GSM revolution, quote unquote. Over the past 2 decades, it's been one of the bigger drivers of growth.
Correct.
Right? Today, the ICT sector is about 17% of GDP.
Correct.
Oil, which a lot of people still think we're an oil economy, is 6%.
Even lower.
6% as of the end of last year.
Correct.
How did we get here?
Yeah, look, great place to start. I think there are two sort of things I'd like to talk about in response to that question. I think, first of all, is really the question of the nature of innovations. I think people think that all kinds of innovations are equal. But what we've seen in the telecom sector is probably my best example of what a market-created innovation is that there are some kinds of innovations that in themselves create new markets. And that's what the telecom sector has done in Nigeria. The fact that you have this underlying infrastructure that is essentially able to power other sort of adjacent industries, adjacent business lines, really means that you have what you call regenerative growth or compounding growth. And that's the story of sort of the ICT or technology or telecoms or startup industry in Nigeria, is that the beauty of these types of innovations are that they are market creating, and they create sometimes unintended outcomes and consequences that we don't envisage in the beginning.
You want to tell me about that?
We can talk about that.
Yeah.
I think the second point I want to sort of highlight is really that an inflection point I always sort of often reflect on is what happened when the administration of President Obasanjo essentially deregulated the telecom sector. I mean, when I was growing up here, and I presume when you were growing up in Nigeria, we all had Nitel landline phones at home.
I didn't even have one. I just didn't have a phone. In those days.
And at some point, we then had dial-up from Nitel.
Yeah.
And the stories are the penetration was if I recall correctly, at some point less than a million lines around the country. Yeah. Today we are at over 70 million subscribers, even more than that last time I checked. So I think you have to credit sort of that sort of opening up of the industry for a lot of the growth we see today. But in itself, it also sort of goes back to the point about the power of market creating innovations, that in reality that demand was there. People wanted to consume telecommunication services. It was always there. But the structure of value creation in the industry was such that there were so many barriers, including costs, including affordability, that people simply couldn't consume what they needed. And so the moment you sort of liberalized the sector and you allowed MCIs
and you mean the telecom sector?
The telecom sector, you unlock growth, and which is why I think if you read the Prosperity Paradox by Fosa Ojama, one of the examples they give for an MCI in Africa is Mo Ibrahim Celtel, right? Probably one of the early sort of telecom ventures out there, and so I think the point I want to just make here is that MCIs create new markets that sometimes create unintended consequences that sometimes can be negative. I mean, because what we've also seen, the unreported part of that growth is that you also then have negative outcomes, which include internet fraud and whatnot.
Okay.
But it's that you get all sorts of outcomes.
But let me just, before we move on, what kinds of markets has it created?
Sure. Perfect.
How would you?
Sure, perfect. So I'll give you a couple.
And when I say it, I'm talking about telecoms.
Sure,
right?
perfect. So I'll give you a few examples. So a couple of years ago, you had a major employer in this country was actually, or a major employment sector was literally recharge card sellers, people who hawked around selling physical recharge cards. We still have some of that in certain parts of the country, but you've seen an evolution in the quality of that job to what you now call VTU, virtual top-up unit sellers. So they're literally people that sort of trade airtime credit. Now, obviously, that sort of form of employment or form of, is now also sort of being threatened by a number of the electronic channels that we now have.
Yeah, I just go to my bank app and I recharge my phone. And I don't have to go find a recharge card.
Exactly. And so that's an example. But another dimension is the layers of new businesses and new categories of companies that are only possible because you have that underlying infrastructure. So here comes
smartphones.
Yeah, smartphones. So here comes probably the entire technology ecosystem.
The payments.
The payments businesses. And then on top of those payment businesses are now the businesses that can only exist because you have the payment businesses. So the way to think about a digital economy is as a stack. At the base of that stack, you need sort of connectivity, you need telecoms, you need credit. I mean, there's still some of the pieces that we need to do better at building in Nigeria. You have identity, you have credit, and then on top of that, you then have payment, and then on top of payment, you can build health tech, ed tech. And so in the Obasanjo administration definitely left us with one of the critical pieces of sort of building the contribution to GDP that we now have. Exactly.
Okay. So tell me about some of the drivers of that growth. And we'll get back to like what else can we be doing.
Sure.
But what are some of the drivers? So has it been global capital? Has it been local capital? And the other part of that question, let me not stack my question too much, but the other part of that question is, how does the current retrenchment in global capital, how do you think it might affect? Two questions though, so let's try and, first I want to think about what has been, how have we gotten here? What has been the driver
of the growth,
And then we can talk about what the future of global capital looks like, the impact.
Sure. So look, 17% is no mean feat, especially in a country that is up until recently was mostly recognized as a oil economy, and so it's actually a major achievement, and I think it's reflective of the potential that is still possible in diversifying our economy. As we look at the drivers of the growth, I think first of all, we start from sort of effective regulation, right, or deregulation of the sector. I think you also have regulators like the NCC that have, to a large extent, have been pro-growth, have really sort of been very careful in managing and enabling growth in the sector.
Would you say it's been highly regulated? Because it seems to me like it was an area that wasn't that regulated. Because they didn't. It didn't exist, right? So they had to create new regulations as payment businesses started.
So where we were, first of all, is that there was just no room for private participation.
Initially, of course, yeah.
And then the first thing that happened was you then created a framework and said we would take private participation.
Yeah, sold licenses.
We had allowed some locals, which is the other thing that I think has really helped. I think Nigeria would potentially have achieved slightly different outcomes if we were too protective or restrictive by insisting that you wouldn't allow international players into the space. I think we have to be very. MTN has played a critical role in ensuring that the ecosystem has been vibrant. I often think that competition is great.
What role has it played? Is it investment? Because they're making a ton of money from Nigeria. What role?
They are making a ton of money, and definitely they probably. I'm sure some people hold views that they can do a lot more here. And but
my MTN service used to be crap, but it's better now. I used to be mad at it. I'm like, why are you not investing in better infrastructure if you're making so much money?
I've used multiple telcos, and I now say yellow as it goes. I think definitely that the foreign investment that they have been able to attract has definitely helped the growth of the sector. I think it definitely ensures that all the other players have also tried to measure up, and so that sort of lifts boats. Yeah, obviously there can be more investment in the space. We can welcome that.
Competition, that competition has helped.
But I think the competitiveness has definitely helped the sector. I would also say, look, I think because you then had that. In 20.
So you're saying that's one of the drivers of growth, competition.
I think
trying to keep up with some of the external players that came in with more money.
I definitely think
that's
so.
That's a good point.
Now, some will argue as well that the regulator has also set price sort of floors. For what the telcos can charge, and there's a school of thought that suggests perhaps that should be sort of taken out so that prices can fall. But I think excessive competition can often lead an industry to a point where where prices are just not sustainable. So I think the regulator has definitely been thoughtful in its approach. I do think that there are benefits that we can derive from lower connectivity. Nigeria actually has one of the lowest connectivity costs in the region. However, when you compare with a place like India, for instance, a lot of the growth India has seen has been as the result of really connectivity costs that are very, very low.
But I think I think that's a good point. But let me push you on that, which is, that seems to me as a function of digital infrastructure rather than regulation or even setting prices, or even allowing prices to. Because what you don't want is for there to be unconstructive competition that's driving prices down to the point where nobody's then investing.
Correct.
And we do have a problem with digital infrastructure across the country, even though we have a lot of fiber connections, sea cable connections, and you understand the technicalities of this better.
The distribution in the hinterland is not where it needs to be.
And I know that there's some regulatory problems with states' right of way, and they charge too much. But isn't that, I don't know, isn't that the bigger problem? What if you want to compare us to India? Isn't that the bigger problem? Is that the last mile infrastructure is just not
I am not the expert in this space, but again, this is where I give the regulator credits to say Nigeria is not India and India is not Nigeria. So as much as we look at India with admiration in some regards, it is a different situation. You are right. I think I suspect that what the regulator has been doing is striking that balance between the need to allow for healthy margins so that investments can continue, while also improving accessibility from a price standpoint. And so I expect that some of those sort of limits on the floor of pricing would evolve over time. But I also think a lot of progress has also been made in sort of evolving how we think about right of way, such that we're not taxing investment, but rather taxing consumption, which is what you need to do. And so certain states have actually rolled back. I think Kaduna, Ekiti states, you know, where my you know, I've got lots of friends. I've really been progressive with ensuring that you know, right of way doesn't become a hindrance to investment. So you know, I think you have all of this going on, but I think from 20, you know, from the 2000s, the 2010s, we now started to see sort of the emergence of a digital technology startup ecosystem that was now possible because you had that first sort of base, and that has been
you're talking about like the payments businesses.
So starting with the payments businesses, the likes of Paystack and Flutterwave. That came on scene, and you know, before Paystack or Flutterwave, if you are a young person making leather shoes in Imo State, you really had a very small market. You could only sell to people that came to your stall, or maybe by chance you would send some to your cousin who was traveling to Toronto or something. But today with Paystack, at least from 2016, 2017, you could host it on a website, and you could collect payment from anyone in the world. That is incredibly powerful. Fast forward today, between Paystack and Flutterwave, they probably serve anywhere between, you know, but my last check, anywhere between 500,000 to 2 million merchants, or probably anywhere between 500,000 to 1 million merchants or more, because it keeps growing. And it speaks to sort of the market creating potential of these technologies, is that
because you're allowing other markets to thrive by
building what is
solutions.
What is an MCI?
So let's talk about the role of capital. Nigeria has been one of the largest recipients of venture capital funding.
Correct.
Which, you know, your firm is one of the people who takes that money and invests in all these innovations. And if you look at, you know, where all the money that goes to Africa, for example, it's going, Nigeria is number one. Nigeria is getting, like, you know, the biggest chunk of that. By far the biggest chunk, right? There has been some reduction in some of those flows of late. Do you see that, you know, are you concerned? Do you see some replacements for that funding, or how do you think the sector can navigate this?
Yeah, great question. Look, 2020, 2021, 2022, coming out of COVID were years of exuberance. I think the world was awash with borderline almost free money. Interest rates were too low.
Actually, I shouldn't complain. Low.
Yeah, maybe too low.
I'm missing those low. My mortgage. We bought a house during COVID, and that mortgage just looks great. Like,
exactly.
A lot better than today.
But it probably wasn't attainable. And so what you saw is, thankfully, we started Ventures Platform in 2016. There was no capital. Like, literally, when we started Ventures Platform, all of the venture that was attracted in Africa was, you know, less than $100 million, if I remember correctly.
Wow.
Today, our fund...
We're talking about billions.
Today, the fund we manage is, you know, essentially a $50 million fund, 47 point something, so about a $50 million fund. So that's one fund. Today, already... this year, African startups have attracted in excess of 1.5 billion, right? Slightly lower than where we were last year, but I think it's also important to contextualize that there's been a pullback from venture and other asset classes as a consequence of what's happening with the global economy,
and also higher interest rates.
Higher interest rates. Right? So folks are sort of allocators of capital. You know,
they're not as starved for high yields.
Exactly.
In riskier markets.
There's also a movement to safety, and there are slightly safer options that can offer more sort of slightly higher guaranteed returns. I think venture still remains a critical asset class in the sense that it's probably one of the few asset classes that if what you're looking for is an outsized return, it's one of the few asset classes that can offer that. Venture is not where you come for stability or safety, but it's also an asset class that is exciting because it creates new markets, as we've just discussed. In the absence of venture, you wouldn't have the pay stacks, the flutter waves of this world.
And for people who don't know venture, we're talking about early stage investing.
Early stage venture capital, essentially investing in businesses that sometimes are started by young people, sometimes started by older people, at the earliest stage of their sort of development, where the key job is really being able to identify and try to take a punt on, or take a view rather on who has the better chance at building something that can
and
be
these
incredible.
are at stages where it will be nearly impossible for them to get loans, or difficult to get loans because they don't really have.
So when I started in 2009 after moving here with my technology company, I tried to get loans. There were just no loans. So I literally had to raise family and friends, bootstrap my business, and so historically. Technology startups are not the ideal candidates for loans, and so the asset class that tends to fund them is actually venture capital.
Right.
But going back to your question, going back to your question, so yes, globally there's a pullback in capital. We've seen, and so what's happening in Africa or Nigeria is no different than what's happening in the rest of the world. But I think the saving grace is that unlike 2016 or 2010, we now have a semblance of a local funding ecosystem. So you've got funds like Ventures Platform, you've got a few other funds like, Ingressive, you've got funds like Lofty Inc., you've got funds like TLCom, you've got a number of other funds, Future Africa of this world, that are run by local managers that have a local mandate, so they are not opportunistic. Nigeria or Africa is not just one of their markets, and so this is the focus, and so we're here to stay. And so what you have is a scenario where I feel pretty confident that if I invest in a good company at the earliest stage, for the next round of funding, there is an opportunity for them to actually receive funding locally. It's definitely gotten slightly harder than it was in 2021 or 2022, but it's not a death wish like it would have been. And so I think we're in an environment where only the best companies are able to sort of attract capital.
Maybe it's not a bad thing.
And that in itself is not so terrible. I think what we saw as well in 2020 and 2021 on the back of the Paystack exits was that there was now an increased interest for local capital to participate. So our fund is actually probably one of the few funds that has a significant local participation element.
How much?
Probably something in the region of 15 to 20% of our fund is actually local capital. And we consider that a very strategic.
And from where locally? Pension funds, private?
No pension funds yet.
Because our pension funds are too focused on buying government securities.
We hope that I understand that pension funds can now look at folks like us. And so we hope that
there's a ton of money in the pension fund.
There is a ton of money.
But they're not risking that. They're not risking it.
Exactly. And venture actually presents an opportunity to sort of have a barbell strategy in sort of their investment outcomes, their portfolio outcomes. And
fingers crossed for that.
Exactly. We need more pension money in the space. But family offices, some corporates are very proud to say UAC, probably one of Nigeria's oldest corporates, is one of our LPs, private individuals, and I think that's important to sustain an ecosystem. You need the participation of local capital, as I like to say, capital with context, so that you deploy capital, but you can bring much more than capital. Because ultimately, if all of the capital that is being invested in our startups is foreign, you have to think about it as some kind of economic some kind of economic takeover, or some will call it there's a lot of talk about decolonization now, but you have to think about it as a reverse economically, right? Because when the outcomes happen, a lot of that capital goes offshore.
They're just going to repatriate
exactly
profits.
But where it's local capital, yes, some of it might go offshore, but you know that some of it will trickle down and would sort of remain here locally. So I'm a strong advocate for local participation, and we're really glad that our fund has been able to sort of get some of that.
Hopefully, a good pitch for the pension funds to look to look more closely at this. And I want to, we come back. I want to ask you a little bit about where we think the sector is going, right? And maybe we can talk more about relationship with governments later, and like the new government, if we have any thoughts and like what they could do. Let's think constructively about what they could do differently.
Sure.
But first, we've talked about the kinds of things the tech sector has been doing. It's been pretty soft tech, payment stuff, right?
Correct.
When are we, when are we going to start doing the big boy stuff, right? AI, chips, semiconductor, how ambitious can we be?
Yeah. Look, you raise a very, very valid point. I think the ecosystem has been focused on ones and zeros, the soft stuff. But I think that's the obvious reasons why that has been the case. These have been the more relevant to the conditions of the people and the context, but also given a lot of what has been achieved with very little. Very little. Nigeria has raised a fraction in venture capital. Well, all of Africa only accesses 1% of global venture capital. So even with all the billions that we're talking about, it's less than 1% of global venture. If you look at the portion that comes to Nigeria, it's probably in the region of 0.3% of global venture, or 0.2% of global venture. But more importantly is that Shola was probably struggling with connectivity when he was writing the Paystack code. He definitely was struggling with access to power. So you don't have enough power to charge your laptop, and you want to think about microchips. Do you understand?
Yeah.
So these are the issues. Is that a lot of the innovation that has been built has been built with what we have in our hands, and so I think we can't be too hard on ourselves. I think there's also the reality that because the flow of capital, we can't say we have excess capital, right? And so people have tended to build things that they believe would easily attract capital, right? And so if you see capital flowing in the direction of fintech, you're going to build a fintech, right? And so we need more
ambition.
We need more ambition, but this is also where government can play a role. When I have an opportunity to speak to government, whenever government is thinking about maybe setting up a fund of fund or setting up some kind of catalytic capital to unlock capital, I actually think that capital should be focused on these sectors that are of strategic importance, but are not necessarily attracting commercial private capital, because and actually that's what happened in other markets like the US.
Sometimes government needs to encourage the things that will be too hard for the markets to do themselves, like you're saying.
It's sometimes called the cold start problem. You have to come in and jumpstart sort of that segment. We're seeing that in renewables. People talk often about Tesla and the big support they get from the US government. These things don't just happen because they're quite hard to do. And which is why, in the earlier in a couple of years ago, a lot of my colleagues in the ecosystem would have, and I was also guilty of this actually, would often say we don't need government. Government should get out of the way. I think that is such a pipe dream. I think we need government. We need to sit at the table, because government, if we're going to truly build meaningful strategic technology and innovations,
that is long term.
That is long term.
And sometimes it's not, like you said, it may not attract capital today.
Exactly.
But it's necessary.
Exactly.
Fundamentally.
Government has a role to play.
Our
large wealthy individuals and companies have a role to play. But we also have a role to play. The entrepreneurs also have to be more ambitious, and also build use cases that are relevant. But these are some of the challenges that I see when it comes to some of this technologies.
And do you think that the current administration gets it and can be constructive in this conversation? Because obviously we have a new minister and we don't have to talk about him in particular, but we have new leadership in this space, and we also have the new startup bill that I think was if from the outside looking in, it seemed like a time in which Nigeria's tech industry finally realized that a relationship with government can and should be constructive, right?
Correct.
Because I saw that it was a
collaborative
effort to get there, right? So I guess, how do you see what would your advice be to this government, right? Given what we know about the relationship and the history and where we are today.
Yeah, I'm being very careful.
Yeah.
But look, I think the startup bill and the appointment of the Honorable Minister of Digital Economy, Communications and Innovation, I think both are watershed moments for this industry and for Nigeria.
And for context, for people who don't know, he comes from the industry.
Which was my next point, is that for the first time, we have an individual who was an integral part of the ecosystem, having built CC Hub that supported startups like Budget and Blood Bank and a couple other sort of social impact critical startups. Someone that's worked in the policy space and really a respected part of our industry is now the minister. And so you know for sure that he gets it, he can empathize, he has contacts within the industry and globally to really help move the needle. Very proud to say myself and a number of others are actively working with him from the private sector perspective. And so I'm pretty confident that the administration means business. And I'm very bullish that, and as we're already seeing, I mean, he recently released his strategic roadmap or plan, a concise version of it. And from my read of it, it seems that, I mean, there's talk about sort of the blockchain policy that's going to be developed. There's a focus on implementing the startup bill, which again, I already said was, in my mind, a coming-of-age moment for the ecosystem, in that for the first time you saw the ecosystem collaborating with government. And I frankly think that that bill, which I'm very proud to have been part of bringing to life, is actually a gift to this administration. Is that you now have the frame to actually develop constructive policy that can enable government move from being a regulator of the ecosystem to being an accelerant of the ecosystem. I think to some extent, government has been supportive, I have to say. The last administration did its bit. I mean, the bill got passed in the last administration. This administration gifted us with a minister that gets us. But I think in some regard, there are certain things, there are certain instances where I've wondered, are you going to, do you want to sort of stunt growth, or do you want to accelerate growth?
Room for improvement. Where the areas for improvement.
Exactly. So I really think government needs to become pro-ecosystem in a way that you see other markets, places like India, really realizing that if we want to grow our economy, we want to diversify our economy, and we want to create opportunities for our youth, this is a sector that we have to place on.
Basically, you're saying an all of government coordinated approach.
Exactly.
Of realizing that this is a key sector and we need to kind of promote it.
If I'm launching a startup that needs a license, it shouldn't take me 2 years to get a license or a year to get a license. I'm sorry to say that there's some cases where that has been the case. Right. And so there needs to be a fast track process for companies to get regulated, to get licensed, so they can operate within the ambits of the law. For the more emerging technologies, innovation, regulation should not precede innovation. We should allow the innovators innovate, study what they're doing, and create the protections that the consumer requires. So really progressive innovation that stimulates growth as opposed to becoming a friction.
So let me just ask you on that, and this might be a good place for us to end, which is, can government do it effectively with the reality that we have, not the reality that we want? So this is what I mean. We have a government that we have a poorly resourced civil service. Let me put it that way. And sometimes, despite the best intentions of the smartest minister, you still need a team to implement.
Correct. And
we spend about 2% of our GDP on civil service, on, I would say, all of government's salaries. The point I'm making is it's not a lot.
Correct.
Right? Compared to, 5% in Kenya, smaller economy, 7% in Ghana. I mean, I'm not saying that we should be spending that much.
Because there's still a lot of talk about government spending needing to go down.
I think that is my own view. But this is not our conversation.
Right?
I think that's mistaken because people don't get the context. We're actually not. We need to be more effective in how we're spending it. But we actually need to be spending it more.
I was just going to say, I think what most people actually have an issue with is the efficacy of what has been spent. So I think we're definitely spending in the wrong direction. I think a lot of the spending is going to politicians when it should be going to the civil service.
I don't want us to get distracted.
So
the point I wanted to make is, say for example, let me just take one example from the setup bill. Deploying a fund of funds.
Correct.
Right? The question that people will have is, can the government actually do this well? Can they actually figure out where the money should go, or should we just let the private sector do it?
Great question. So first of all, I have to say, I think I have met some incredibly smart people in government, both the civil service, and I'm sure you know several as well. And so I think the civil service has lots of competent people. I have met a number of the folks that work with some of the current ministers that we have and past ministers, and they are some of the finest. I mean, we are seeing more and more private sector people step into government to work with government officials. Yes, maybe there are some gaps when you go through the entire sort of apparatus or the entire, but I don't think it's impossible. I think what we need more of is the public-private partnership, where government doesn't necessarily have to be the implementer. The role of government is actually to create the enabling environment. And
fund it, but they don't necessarily have to be the ones managing the fund.
No. So for instance, in the example that you raised, the design that was intended from the bill is that the National Sovereign Investment Authority, the NSIA, manages the fund. I don't know that it necessarily has to be to make the investments directly. Some of us in the industry have a view that it should take a fund-to-fund approach, where
it funds
that are closer to the innovations and are experts at
with some guidelines and rules. You can't just invest in a regular fintech. Now we want you to invest in AI and manufacturing and agri-tech or whatever.
Because these are the things that are important to the growth of Nigeria. And I think the same approach is being taken. I mean, the minister just recently, the Honorable Minister just launched the training, the skills plan. And I think the approach there again is to work with the private sector. So look, I think government needs to get out of this business of building and managing hubs and giving grants itself. But because what you do when you do that is you also, it's like when you pass fuel through a pipe, the pipe has to be wet. So you also enable a new generation of local funds that now have capacity, and so you are actually again it becomes sometimes an unintended or maybe it's an intended consequence of your intervention, which is the way I think government needs to be run.
Excellent. I think that's a great place to end.
Yeah.
And thank you again for your time. It was a great conversation, and I hope everybody that is listening learned as much as I did.
Thanks, Amaka. I had a great time chatting and looking forward to more conversations.
Sounds good.